Is
As
the
pretty as
mic
I'm going to
working?
get.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I can hear you, Tommy.
All right. Usually the little Zoom thing's going up and down when I talk. There it goes.
Okay, good. That's all seems to be working. All right, we're live there. That is happening. Give people another, since we're a couple minutes early, and then I will hit record on all the things. You might need to go downstairs and do this, because this is it.
Yeah.
Maybe I need a coffee. I can get one in a minute.
Drinking that nice and slow, Tommy. I'm sure Greg sees it.
Oh, I already knew. So I am highly medicated this morning. There's a lot, I don't know what I have, sinus infection, ear infection, probably a combination of everything. So, yeah. I have that Mucinex in me that has the pseudoephedrine in it. Yeah, that stuff's like a punch to the face, like rocket fuel.
Yeah. I'm always
And I'm
fond of a
drinking
bit
coffee.
Of, yeah, a little bit of pseudoephedrine will get your day started just the way it should do.
Mm-hmm.
Ah, we still got that stupid Zoom thing on top. Rats. Well. Well, welcome to the Packet Pushers live stream here. Let me press the record button before I get too talky. Record to the cloud. Boom. All right, we are live. Packet Pushers holiday live stream. Hello out there. There are, let me count. There's 14 of you watching, and probably half of those are us. It's a small crowd assembled today here at the Packet Pushers holiday, but we're looking for your questions. That's mostly what we wanted to talk about today. So if you're watching us on YouTube, and folks, it is climbing, go ahead and hang on a second.
Yes, this is live.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Difficulties.
We got a producer that just had speakers go nuts, so sitting over to the side there. So if you got questions for us anyway in this live stream, we want your questions. That's the primary thing. And if you don't have questions, we'll come up with things to talk about because we're good at that, if nothing else.
That's true.
That is for sure. So let's go around the table and introduce who's here. We got more people that'll be joining us. We got several other people that said they were going to join us in this chat. And as they come in, we'll announce them too. But of course, you got me. I'm Ethan Banks, co-host of the Packet Pushers podcast on heavy networking and Day 2 Cloud. Greg Farrow up next.
Hey, it's Greg Farrow, co-host of the Network Break podcast and the Heavy Networking podcast, of course. Good to see you all
Tommy
here.
McNichols. Now, you said you were heavily medicated. So with that caveat, tell us who you are and what you do.
I'm a solution architect at a company called Technology. We're an integrator out of Southern California. I would describe myself as a jack of all trades, turned network guy, turned automation guy, turned automation cynic. So here I am.
Automation cynic. Oh, we got to dive into that at some point. Ned Bellavance.
Hello. Ned Bellavance of Ned in the Cloud. I co-host the Day 2 Cloud podcast on Packet Pushers and also author courses for Pluralsight. You can find me on Twitter, Ned1313.
And you're a sucker for writing books too. You can't seem to stop.
So yeah, I actually just got the 5 free copies of my first book in the mail yesterday. That was exciting. I don't know how to feel about it. I'm like, oh, so I did that. Now,
Yeah, but you
crossed
did
off
it
the bucket
ages
list.
ago. It's one of those things that you did ages
I
ago,
know, right?
and it's like it's finally here, and you're like, oh, that project, that's like, yeah.
Definitely
Yeah.
finished writing that in August, and December
Yeah.
rolls around. Like, oh yeah, I vaguely remember writing this. Okay. Exciting.
Well, next up, as we go around the table here, we get to Drew Convery Murray.
Hi, Drew Convery Murray. I am also a Packet Pusher, co-host of the Network Break podcast, and also showing up here and there on other podcasts on the Packet Pushers Network. I'm on Twitter at Drew_CM and excited to be here. I don't have a Christmas sweater, but I do have Christmas pajamas, so I dressed for the occasion.
Yeah, I noticed that. Like, what are you wearing for reals? Okay, come on. Oh boy, Christmas PJs. That's perfect. You're setting us up nicely for vacation, Mr. Drew.
Good.
And Russ White has joined us. Take yourself off mute, Russ. There you are.
Hey guys, I don't know. Nobody knows who I am, so I'm just going to sit here and be quiet.
Yeah, right.
Right. Yeah, sure.
Well, first, we got a couple of questions that have come in already. We got Basil has asked, "Hi guys, please talk about the new Cisco One Silicon." So,
Do we have
Drew and
to?
Greg, I think you guys have dug into that a bit, right? I'm not sure who else has researched it. I look at it and said, "Oh gosh, another ASIC," and I went, "Oh." Farrah,
Okay.
let's start with you. I think you've done some homework and have an opinion, because you always have an opinion. That's who you are. It's what you do.
I've got to dig up my notes that I prepped. We talked about this a lot on the Network Break podcast this week. So if you want if you want more than what we got there, and if you want to hear it again, head on over to the Network Break podcast on Packet Pushers and listen to this week's show, the 18th of December. Basically, Cisco's in 2016, Cisco bought a company called Libar Systems, which is an Israeli company that is a fabless semiconductor. That is, they sit around designing silicon every single day. And between 2016 and here today, 2019, Cisco's been spinning this ASIC. And since 2017, it's been out selling it to customers and saying, is this what you want? Is this what you want? Is this really what you want? That's what they said during the presentation while calling it an innovation. Libar Systems, I'm told, so the genesis of Libar Systems is that they're actually the people who are behind the Jericho silicon that's now at Broadcom. So the Jericho silicon is the chipset that drives the high-end Broadcom system. So if you're building a chassis around the Broadcom ASIC family, if you're trying to build a router, not a high-end router, there's certain things. The Jericho chipset is the one. It's not a top of rack. It's not a chassis Ethernet type of solution. It is something that sits way up in the high end in the router space. So at this point in time, Cisco's announced that they're making the ASIC. Perhaps the most interesting part about the ASIC is they're not only going to use it in their own silicon, in their own chassis, and they announced a new series of 8,000 series routers, which will be sold to service providers, and in particular to cloud companies. So the hope is that there are cloud companies who have got very high 400 gig type bandwidth to the internet, and they want to have a high speed routing type silicon that faces the internet. The second thing is they're going to sell the ASIC independently. So for companies who wish to buy the ASIC to put into their own white box. So you think again of people like Microsoft and Facebook, who today are struggling to find big routers, white box routers that go at the front end, because the ASICs that go out there, the Jericho isn't quite right. So maybe Russ can talk a little bit later on why Jericho isn't the perfect routing silicon yet, or the June silicon isn't, if he knows the answers there. But then this silicon is going to be there for that. And then, of course, they also talked about the iOS XR. So there's a new version of iOS XR, which is version 7. It's still based on WinRiver Linux, but they've changed it back to more of a monolithic infrastructure. So in iOS 6, they unpacked it and went back to an architecture of modular containers, and every part of the Cisco stack was in its own container, and you could fiddle with it, and you could discombobulate it and rebundle it as you liked. And in iOS XR 7, they've gone to a more bundled model and then implemented their pay-as-you-use licensing model on the top of it. I've had a few discussions. I don't know if anybody from the panel wants to ask me a question about it, but I've had a few questions from people here about reasonably, can Cisco make this work? One person I was talking to was asking whether Cisco can make this work. So if you think about it in terms of 100 gig router ports, if Cisco sells, say, a million 100 gig router ports in the next 5 years, then that means that they'll only need about 10,000 chips, maybe less, maybe more. So that means for the $1 billion they spent getting this company off the ground, including $300 million to buy Libar Systems, you're looking at something in the order of $30,000 a chip, an ASIC. That's just cost price. And if they can scale it up a bit further, maybe get a bit higher, maybe they can get it down to about $20,000 an ASIC. But that is not a cheap ASIC. Broadcom is certainly able to compete here. They've got the Jericho 2s out. No doubt they've got a bunch of Jerichos coming down the pipeline. The speculation is that within a year or two, they'll have a successor that will be interested to this. What makes this a routing silicon, I think, is a good question. The answer here is it has a non-blocking internal architecture, which unlike a switch, which switches non-blocking, this is routing, so you can have very high density virtual output queues on it. It also supports very high levels of TCAM. Everything's 50 gig, so it's a 50 gig SerDes. Every part of the IOs is 50 gig in and out, so it's designed for 400 gig interfaces. And the last part about this is it also supports external memory. So as you are asking routers to have very large TCAM tables or very large routing tables, you can actually attach those to an external memory casing. And this is common to a number of other ASICs these days, where you can use a special type of high-speed DRAM called DXC RAM, if I remember rightly, or DX RAM. And this is very high speed. It's not static RAM and it's not on the chip, but very high speed, so you can hold a couple of million, 5 million BGP routes in the ASIC or near to the ASIC. So it's not a switching silicon. Don't try and compare it to a Trident or a Tomahawk. It's a June Jericho, but it's superior to and past that.
So it sounds like the impact of this is going to be, again, service provider market. I'm glad I only asked you for your top of your head opinion, because clearly you haven't done any research and have no opinion, honestly. But so, I mean, again, service provider oriented, cloud provider oriented, very large scale oriented, not the enterprise isn't going to see there's no use case in the enterprise for this chip for the most part.
Not yet.
Not for the mid market.
It's a very programmable chipset. More so than Jericho, because it has a lot of cores. It's very similar to Ericsson's Spider chip, which nobody's going to know what I'm talking about when I say that. But that's it's like 1,000 cores or 500 cores or something crazy like that. So there's a lot of parallelism, and so you can do a lot of programmability with it. I personally see this more as a swipe at Broadcom myself than anything else.
Yeah, there's definitely an angle of that. We don't want to be stuck with Broadcom and the silicon. We need to be in some control of our thing. But I'm not sure that $1 billion worth of investment, they were very big on saying $1 billion over and over. They also said the word innovation at a rate of up to 3 times per minute. I was actually counting. It was quite, I'm not sure that, but as Russ says, because it's multi-threaded, it means it can process a very large number of flows. It can do things like QoS across the VOQs and things like that. Is that right?
Yep, that's correct.
So, and they're saying it's going to be a single chip that's going to go right across the line. So Silicon One is a whole family of silicon that they sort of teased that this is just the first chip. It's not the last chip. And they called the current generation the Q100, which is implying that there'll be Q200 and whatever going on all the way.
One of the things they made a big deal about is that they're going to use this as a platform to build a variety of chip families. So I think we will see it probably come down into switches at some point. Ethan, you mentioned, is this just for service providers? At the outset, yes, but I can imagine them, needing an excuse to get customers to upgrade their equipment. They're going to roll out a line of switches using this chip as well.
Now, Russ, you said a swipe at Broadcom. There's a lot of ways you could take that. I mean, does it swipe into Broadcom's production capability because some fab had to switch over to Cisco to make this? Or is it that kind of volume, or is it mostly just, hey, we still make ASICs too, Broadcom, you can't have it all?
No, I think it's even more than that, because they're releasing this to other white box makers. So they are directly competing with Broadcom in Broadcom's home territory, in effect.
Are they going to make the SDKs more readily available? Broadcom's been criticized for making it difficult to access some of that stuff.
They're supporting P4, so it's openly programmable.
Is P4 all we need in this case, or do we going to need any deeper magic to expose everything that we need to expose on that chip?
Well, I mean, I don't know. P4 is pretty deep as it is, so it's hard to. I don't know. It's going to be, I guess it's one of those things where it says time will tell, right? Or are they going to go down the side path and just open things that they want to open and then keep the rest for themselves? Or are they truly going to open it up and try to change the market? I'm not entirely certain.
Yeah, so the silicon, during the presentation, they talked about having sonic compatibility. So Microsoft can pick this up. Microsoft is the natural target for this. Microsoft has been buying Juniper and Arista routers to use as and Arista chassis in a routing mode to handle the front end routing. And the speculation would be that Microsoft is looking for a more capable ASIC to run its own operating system, which is based on the Sonic API. It's also definitely a shot at Broadcom, but I also noticed some tweets from various people, notably Martin Casado. He's saying, finally, Cisco's going back to something that it's good at. And that's true, that Cisco has been very good at making silicon for 20 or 30 years, and it kind of walked away from it. And I mean,
yeah, it's funny, Greg, not that many years ago, we were talking about merchant silicon, and the point had come up that, considering how many chips Cisco makes, they're kind of merchant silicon too, in a way. And, that was their bread and butter.
Yeah.
Well, I think they have to sell it to other people to make the numbers work. Like if you're going to produce a chip and spend $1 billion, you can't just produce 10,000 or 20,000 of them just so you've got a product to sell. You have to make this work at scale because Broadcom's there competing with you, and Intel just bought Barefoot, so they've got Tofino, you've got Innovium coming out. Cisco can't sit there fat and pretty producing a chip at whatever price it chooses to charge for it, and customers are going to suck it up and just compete with Juniper. They are going to they've got competitors, right? It's not the market of 10 years ago when they could make whatever they liked and take however long they liked, and people would buy whatever they shipped. So it is different.
I think,
just on
I was just going to say, I think the Sonic compatibility is a really interesting piece because that does imply Psi, right? Because Sonic runs around Psi, and it does, and P4, of course, Sonic P4 will work with Psi, but the Sonic compatibility is really, really an interesting piece of this.
So I reached out to somebody who knows more about the Broadcom APIs than we do. Drew did actually. So, and they got a message back from somebody who actually does this sort of stuff. And he said, it's a step in the right direction. Broadcom recently opened up its APIs a lot more so that there's a lot more ease of use. Normally when you wrote code on the Broadcoms, you had to go and sign away an NDA that basically said you couldn't even mention that you're working on Broadcom ASICs. It was a really draconian thing, and we couldn't get any information about it. But somebody who's still working on that said the current opening of the APIs and the code that Broadcom is putting up on GitHub is a step in the right direction. The public programming interface appears to be just as featureful as the proprietary SDK, but the implementation is still distributed as a binary. It's not much different from other vendors. So there's still a binary that sits above the chip, and you have to get that from the vendor. So it's not open where you can do whatever you like. The vendors are still keeping control, but they're steadily moving to make the binary freely available. You don't have to go on knees begging to get access to the binaries and have a license to write code. And
so this is where
just to be clear, you're talking about Broadcom here, not Cisco, right?
Yeah. But Cisco's doing the same thing. If you want to sign up, I think the chances of Arista getting access to the Cisco Silicon One Q100 ASIC to put into one of their boxes is pretty slim, I would suggest.
Yeah. But so then it's the same model as Broadcom. So therefore you're back into the Psi P4 thing, which is okay. Because what Psi is basically is it's a pluggable architecture with DLLs for each. If you want to call them DLLs, I mean, they call them plugins or something like that.
Yeah. It's a modular code base. So what do I think? I think this is great. I think this is what Cisco needs to do. It needs to, and I mean, Drew can throw some opinions on the table here as well, but I think Cisco had to do this. They're not making any traction with the other things that they've done. They've gone off and bought companies like AppDynamics and Jasper and AI companies. Service provider market shrinking. Enterprise market is stagnant for them. They're not growing. Shareholders are expecting them to grow. The last quarter, they're telling that they're not growing. So they have to do something. And so to pivot back to silicon makes good sense. And however, it's not the market that it was 5 years ago. They have to sell this chip to other people as a chip. So we may actually see white box units shipping out of China with an operating system, and that might work for Facebook or Oracle or those types of organizations who don't have the sort of financial clout to make $1 billion worth of silicon, but do want to have a big end router that's in their control, where they own the ASIC, the physical chassis design, because they want airflow. They want it to be in a 24-inch chassis because their racks are some custom architecture, and they want to be able to choose that. So that opens it up, I think.
Hey, Tommy, do you care about this chip at all in your world? Is this anything that's going to impact sales projects? Anything interesting here?
Nope.
No.
So,
Wow.
Our largest customer might be interested, but they're even the fact that they're doing some crazy automation with the handful of developers on tap, they don't want to program an ASIC. They don't want to program a chip in a router. They just want to put a config in a router.
Well, to be fair,
not
this is
going that
being this is being aimed at a service provider who may, in a white box environment, want that programmability depending on their use cases.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's going to make a big impact. I see what what it's going to enable. So I don't think my enterprise customers are going to buy it though. Not anytime soon. They'll buy it, abstract from as a service from someone else maybe, and they'll flow through it, but they're not going to buy it.
I'm curious how this is going to stack up against what AWS has traditionally been doing, which is developing their own chips. Because we talked about how this is aimed at Microsoft to a certain degree because it can take advantage of Sonic, but AWS does their own thing. I don't even know what kind of networking gear they have in their facilities, and I don't know if they've ever actually said, but I know at least the chip that's on their servers is 100% theirs. And I'm imagining that they're doing similar things at the edge with their routing and switching. So I'm curious if they're going to eventually just have their own routing chipset and maybe make that available as a competitor to this.
Well, I don't know about a chipset, but I do know they're making some interesting hires right now.
Yeah, I know some of what the
Interesting.
AWS networking stack is. I don't. Could be a play here. It's an interesting question.
Would be more of a software play, more of a we'll ship this as part of Outpost or something like that would be the way I would see it, rather than something they retail. Although, it is something I have thought about in the last couple of weeks of what it does to the vendors if AWS decides to ship white box with their own OS. Again, given the hires they're making, who knows?
Right. Yeah, they've been traditionally they've been all software. But using their own hardware in their own data centers. But now they're moving outside of those data centers. They've set up Outposts, which ships into your data center. But then they also set up Outposts. They call them local zones, which is like a mini data
5G,
center.
Yeah.
No, this is something different from Wavelength.
Wavelength, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So Outpost Local Zone, they have one in LA, and basically it's a smaller footprint data center that has a bunch of those outposts that are still managed by AWS, and I think they're multi-tenant, but it's a way to get closer proximity to wherever you are, but it's not going into the Verizon data center or COs.
I think AWS could use the Silicon One family of products, but they would just buy the ASIC. And go from there, right? And they'd get a license from Cisco. Now, whether they would do that instead of doing their own silicon, perhaps, or whether they would continue to work with Broadcom to get the silicon that they want. And also, it would be bad to gamble against Broadcom making an iteration in 12 to 24 months that you couldn't, and catching up. So it's going to be an interesting market. I think it's interesting. I think one other thing that they talked about in the same session, and you can't really separate it, the Cisco One Silicon announcement also include a lot of discussion around silicon photonics and how Cisco is now returning to manufacturing its own SFPs. So it literally owns a silicon photonics company, and it's now binding those into its own SFPs, and it will now sell Cisco SFPs or whatever the module might be for 400 gig. Straight to market. So you'll be able to buy them as standalone products in the open market. Cisco will sell them independently again. You'll also be able to buy them as part of Cisco's products. And they're making a big deal that Cisco SFPs are better quality, higher something, better qualified. They've got Mystic Magical Source inside, and that's the unique part about it. So that remains to be seen. But that is unique. I mean, basically what they've done there is bought the whole stack. They'll still be outsourcing some of the manufacture, but they own the silicon photonics licenses and the manufacturing for that, and then they'll outsource the actual assembly of the SFP. So that is a major change for Cisco. It's a return to, and I'd expect broadly to see Cisco to produce a family of proprietary optic modules. Like we've already seen them produce these bidirectional 40 gigs and bidirectional optics in various speeds where they use less cable than others and all that sort of stuff. I'd expect them to do more of that, standards plus. when somebody says standards plus, that's just proprietary, right? But that sort of stuff. But if they can add some value there for customers, and customers are smart enough to understand that they're being sucked into a lock-in, then that's okay. So
well, let's move the conversation along here. Questions are starting to queue up a bit. So Basil, you just kicked off a 20-minute silicon discussion. I hope you're proud of yourself. You see what you did? Be on you, Basil. It's on you.
I bet you sorry you asked now.
So DJ Drastic asks, cloud trends for 2020. There seems to be a big push now for multi-cloud everything. Will the next hot product now be a multi-cloud hypervisor? Did you just say Kubernetes? Maybe you did. I don't know.
Maybe you did
Maybe
in
you
another
did.
form. Yeah.
Ned, you're the cloud guy,
cool.
so go. A big push for multi-cloud everything in the context of cloud trends and so on. Next hot product being a multi-cloud hypervisor. Do you have thoughts, good sir?
Of course I do. Well, first, the idea of a multi-cloud hypervisor, I think we're just talking about a management layer that sits over your multiple clouds. So if you're in Azure and AWS and GCP, how do you coordinate operations and monitor all those different environments? And so far, most of the products that have come out around that arena are not very good. Just to be straightforward. They either do one of two things. They either focus on a single cloud to the detriment of all the other ones. So typically the multi-cloud hypervisor is really just an AWS hypervisor, and they're going to bolt on Azure functionality any day now. So there's been a lot of that. The other one has been, we will abstract all the concepts from each of the individual clouds, which means you either can't take advantage of the special services in those clouds, like the PaaS type services, or you can, but it's at a very handicapped type way. So I think that's hasn't been solved yet. I don't know if it's going to be solved just because of the big differences between the three major clouds. But you did mention the other thing, which is Kubernetes, which more and more people are talking about as a platform to build platforms on. And the fact that the big three all are using upstream Kubernetes for their managed Kubernetes offering means there's a certain level of interoperability there. So if I want a persistent volume on any of those clouds, I don't have to know anything about the back end of Azure or GCP.
Yep.
I don't need to know exactly how that disk gets created. I just have to say, I want a persistent volume in my YAML, and a persistent volume magically gets created and wired up to my container. And how that happens in the background is an exercise for the cloud providers. So in that same regard, if you can write a custom resource definition and you're like a software supplier or someone who's developing an application for consumption, you develop a CRD, which is basically leveraging the Kubernetes API to create something declaratively. If you have that, that can now be deployed in every single cloud relatively easily, and on premises if you're running upstream Kubernetes on premises. And now you have a common platform that is extensible that you can deploy applications on and manage in a consistent way.
Yeah, I mean, a traditional hypervisor is way closer to the hardware than Kubernetes is. Kubernetes is, more up here, but man, it's doing such a similar function. It's kind of an interesting way to position it, to call it a multi-cloud hypervisor. But it kind of is, because it's got the providers. It can talk to all the different clouds. You talk to Kubernetes, as you were just saying, that you don't have to care about the underlying how these apps are running, because Kubernetes is just handling that for you.
No, I want to put some caution there.
Yeah. Well,
while
yes,
it is,
go ahead.
these are future looking ideas, because if you look at Kubernetes right now, there's still a lot of things that need to be addressed. Multi-cluster management is not there. You manage each Kubernetes cluster individually, and there's projects from people like Rancher that are doing their best to create sort of a multi-cluster management, but it's not there today. So that was a big focus at KubeCon was, all right, I've got 30 clusters and I can't go to every single one. It would be like running 30 vCenters in your data center.
I might have the vocabulary a little wrong, but I know some folks doing this at scale, and they don't even run high availability for the management level. They just build one every time, and they're fine. It's been easier from an overhead perspective to have lots of APIs to talk to versus trying to make everything completely federated and highly available. Like it's just, it gets away from you too fast to maintain. So they gave up. They're going to wait.
Ned, the people we were talking to at KubeCon that were doing any sort of federation, it kind of wasn't. It was more like, there's some common thing at the top that runs a bunch of scripts in parallel on all the clusters at the same time. It was fairly primitive. There wasn't.
Yeah.
It wasn't like, etcd distributed, across to manage all of this and have a uniform source of truth or anything like that. It was just, let's make sure we run this command everywhere at the same time so that all the clusters are doing the same thing. It was very far from my idea of federation.
There's been some interesting things happening with the policy agent. So the idea that you can apply a uniform policy across all of your clusters and have that policy impact the nodes, the containers, your network configurations. So if you can create an abstract policy and just push that down to all the clusters you know about, you don't need like a vCenter running per se. You don't need that constant on appliance that's running somewhere. You just need something that you can fire up that knows about all these different clusters. I want to update my policy. Here's the new policy, push it down, and you're done. Or you could have sort of a rollout where it hits your dev clusters first for validation and then hits the additional clusters. So it's almost like you could set up a CI/CD pipeline for Kubernetes cluster management.
And some folks do, I think.
Yeah. So, yeah, I'm sure these things are already happening out in the wild. So it's probably incumbent on some of the application vendors to come up with a packaged solution that looks slick and works well, that they can sell into enterprises that traditionally don't want to build these tools in-house.
Do you see this as a long-term play for somebody like VMware then, that's already trying to integrate Kubernetes into their hypervisor in vCenter?
Well, that's certainly their vision of it. And if you talk to Joe Beta or any of the other fine folks that were from Heptio that were brought into the VMware fold to design out their Kubernetes build, that's exactly what they're trying to do. They're trying to build that multi-cluster, higher level management and make it easier to consume Kubernetes. And at the same time, they're doing weird things with vSphere and vCenter to try to incorporate Kubernetes as the control plane for that. So we'll see how that goes. That's Project Pacific. It's in private preview right now with a couple really big customers, but I have it on good authority that either by the end of this year, which we're coming up really close, or the first quarter of next year, it will be available for a more public beta preview.
I got to see a good dive on that the other day, and I was blown away by the depth at which the thought, because vSphere integrated containers came off very much as a science project. I'm pretty sure it actually was written by grad students. But when I saw the depth at which they were doing it and the level of problem solving they were doing, like I was pretty blown away that it's going to be able to spin up VMs as in the same way you would spin up a container as part of your stack. And I was like, okay, that's trending towards solving the data issue. So I like that, you know, they're going to help the customer drive their private, because if you still go to bat and scope a private cloud, even if not even going down to like white box gear, you can still wipe the public cloud to the floor with price. Like I still don't understand why there's not a competent way to have a, you know, place of consumption at a controlled cost. And most of my customers have built these giant data centers and have the cooling, they have the racks, they have the power, and they've prepaid for all of it. Probably some of it's off the books even. And why wouldn't you run in a place that's so cost efficient? As long as the stack permits it and the availability is in line. But
so I think you make a good point about multi-cloud, which is the myth of multi-cloud, which is the price you pay for going multi-cloud, which is private, public, private, public, public, you know, wherever, whatever mix of that sort of on-prem, off-prem, many clouds. If you're wrapping everything in a container, then you're responsible for generating everything yourself. So if you want to create a fraud service, a fraud discovery service, you have to generate that and install it in a container. Or the smart move would be to use AWS's fraud management service, where they're actually just announced it at the last conference. You can just send data into it and it'll tell you if this is a fraudulent transaction. But as soon as you start using AWS services, you're not multi-cloud anymore. And if you're over in Google running AI data analysis and using their AI thing, then all of a sudden you're looked into Google's cloud. These clouds are aggressively proprietary. Every one of those services that AWS announced means you can't leave. Because if you're stuck using AWS's RDS, you can't just pick up that RDS and then move it on-prem. You're locked
I always
in.
describe it as the least common denominator issue. So if you go try and use a cloud management platform like VRA, Morpheus, Clicker, any one of those kinds of things. As you add your endpoints in and start to try and build against a VPC or a vSphere deployment, what you find is a lot of the features or things you want to do. So let's say you go the distance and build like a security model to apply on top of a deployment in Amazon, and then you go and try and do that in Azure, and you run up against group limits and tag limits, and you totally screw up your deployment in Azure. Basically, you orphan these child objects, and there's this, 1,000 security groups out there with no things in them. You're just, I don't know if you actually solved anything. So I think when the requirements stay light, some of those tools work very well, but then when you go the distance on them,
and the challenge here is the shadow IT. As soon as that developer goes off the ranch and sucks in an AWS or a Google or an Azure custom service, that's it. All your carefully plans for, a multi-cloud strategy just blew up. I think multi-cloud is basically bunk in practice. There is no way a developer is going to go into AWS and not use one of those fancy services because they've got a deadline next week, and that'll be cheaper and quicker and less work for them. So
it comes down to optimization versus, state optimization surface trade-off, right? And all you're saying is I'm going to abstract out these multiple cloud services into a quasi cloud service that everyone can use, but I'm going to do that by abstraction, which means I lose all the optimized individual services that I can get my hands on. So yeah, I'm not really sure I see the buy there. I'm not really sure. Like I can see multi-cloud in this situation. I'm a bank. I'm going to develop a new application that talks to customers, and I want AWS's security stuff, like Greg said. I'm going to develop that application only in the cloud, but multi-cloud for me is going to mean I'm not moving stuff between the clouds. I'm not moving workload. I'm moving data between the clouds. And that's all it's going to mean for me.
And just competently using all of them, right?
Right. Yeah.
That's what it really is.
Greg is either muted or he just likes talking.
Yeah, we lost your audio, buddy.
Well, no, I was letting other people talk, and I have to press to talk. But I think the point here is that expecting people, enterprise IT, to have that discipline and control over what's happening in a DevOps environment is pretty laughable, when we already know that for many enterprises, shadow IT in the cloud, the public cloud particularly, is already rampantly out of control. I've seen different surveys showing 30 to 60% of cloud usage in enterprise IT is shadow IT. They didn't even know. Somebody just went off and started a project, and suddenly enterprise IT gets a bucket full of, AWS cloud dumped on them because the developer said, I'm finished now and I'm gone. So I'm a little bit curious. And I also think networking in the cloud is not a solved problem. I think that if you're, especially networking in Kubernetes, it's a train smash. Basically, the idea that people are going to run Kubernetes with any semblance of networking acumen or capability is pretty much a joke. It's right now, I look at Kubernetes and go, that smells like OpenStack.
Ooh, those are fighting words. I think, as far as I can tell, the folks who have been involved in Kubernetes that were also involved in OpenStack at least learned something from what happened with OpenStack. And what they've tried to do is keep the core of Kubernetes very focused on what it does, and then farm out the other modules to different projects to get that part right. So here's a stable core, build on it. They've been trying to pull things out of what they call in-tree, so stuff that is in the tree of Kubernetes. They've been doing their best to kick as much out as they possibly can. Like before, the networking and the storage providers for Azure and AWS and GCP were all in-tree. They were part of that Kubernetes binary, which meant every time one of them wanted to rev something about their storage, it had to rev the entire version of Kubernetes. Well, they said that doesn't work. That's not feasible. So they now have the container networking interface, the CNI, and the container storage interface, CSI, and they are slowly moving everything out of the tree into these own projects, where Microsoft, every time they want to rev the Azure CNI, they can go ahead and do that, because all Kubernetes, when it wants to do networking with Azure, it just says, hey, go use that CNI, and then it'll use whatever the version you specify is. When it comes to networking, I think early Kubernetes probably overcomplicated things. But
they were doing it to be simple. Remember that.
Right.
Well, I mean, that's the thing about
crowds.
So, I mean, to get a little esoteric here, abstraction is just a way of pushing complexity down the stack and presenting a simple interface. But when you hide things from the person consuming it, that's a whole bunch of stuff that can break they don't know about. And people do dumb things all the time, and if you dig through that abstraction and break something by accident and now you don't know how to fix it, that's a serious problem. So I think Kubernetes was trying to make it easy by making it really complex under the abstraction, and now they're starting to peel back those layers and saying, do we really need to NAT everything if we can just get a big enough IP address space from the subnet that this node cluster is sitting on? Like, I don't need each individual node to have a /16 subnet assigned to it. That's a little unnecessary. Why don't I just take a larger network space in the subnet where I have my 20 workers or whatever in, and dole out those IP addresses to each container as it spins up and spins down? And as long as I've planned adequately for that, I won't run out of IP addresses and I don't have to do NAT. So that's one way they've been sort of approaching this. But everything right now is Berkeley, the extended Berkeley packet filter, that's handling all the firewall rules for the various containers. I think the networking stack has gotten simpler over the last year or so for Kubernetes, but by no means is it done. But I would posit that networking is never done. Otherwise, the spot.
I was going to say, has networking ever really been solved? But
I would say, contrasting back to OpenStack, though, I remember peeling back the onion on OpenStack and wanting to just gouge my eyes out, like trying to learn it.
Yeah.
And then I think I did, I think it was one of the learning sites, Nigel Poulton's Kubernetes course. And I was running and in like an hour and a half.
Mm-hmm.
And I think from the customer perspective, anytime you have this kind of technology that's like at this level of consumption, there's a tendency to want to get into it, but then they don't realize how much of it they have to own. And when it came to OpenStack, you really had to own it. Like there was so many things, like you had so many choices too. So there was so many ways you could, connect to the network and bind things. And there were very few opinionated stacks, and even the ones that were opinionated, you still have way too many options. So like out of the box, Kubernetes gives you a lot without having to massage it. And then when you do massage it, you don't have to own it to the nth degree. Like you don't have to bring developers on staff and commit to the upstream system to be able to get it to do what you want to do. It's pretty out of the gate. You can just use it. And that's a pretty big differentiator to OpenStack. So I think a lot of folks are seeing some success with it because of that you don't have to own it to that level of depth.
Yeah. And I think people forget how complicated stuff like VMware is. Like that is not a simple product. I just set up a vSphere vCenter cluster in my lab at home. And if I compare that to how much work it is to stand up, a couple worker nodes and a master node for Kubernetes, it's actually way more work for me to get all the bells and whistles working properly for vSphere. And I think people, just because we're used to it, especially those of us who were virtualization admins, that this is all learned knowledge. We forget how difficult it was to learn this stuff up front. So I'm not worried about Kubernetes being too complicated because we learn complicated things all the time. We just forget how much effort it was to learn it most of the time. I hope that it continues down the track that it's going on right now by maturing and sort of locking down the core and letting the other vendors build solutions on top of it. And I think in the next year or two, you're going to see a ton of software vendors start packaging their applications specifically for Kubernetes distributions instead of, giving you an MSI to install or something along those lines. They're like, no, here's the Helm chart. Here's your license key, go.
Yeah, and we're going to get surprised because it's going to be the big ones that we chalk up as being the COTS in the data center. So I guarantee you some folks at SAP are going after doing this, and a lot of those folks are buying large VMware footprints today, and they're going to have an option to run it a different way. In fact, I was involved in a project earlier this year, and we were putting a VMware stack, and they were going to run it just OVAs and deploy, and we got to a point where they're like, well, we might want to put this, we have to deploy doing vCloud Director because that's how we do our deployments that we've packaged for this. And they're like, but we also have a Kubernetes option. I was like, okay, let's talk about that. If this thing is stateless, then come on.
Yeah.
All right, we have some questions, more questions that have queued up. Some of these are along the Cisco realm. Meg asks, a long-time listener, first-time caller. Hi, Meg. Nice to meet you. Anyone planning on taking on Cisco's new cert path? That is Meg's question. So, Tommy, you just raised your hand. You were looking at CCIE Enterprise, I guess you said in the chat.
Yeah, I've mostly done VMware certifications. I've danced around. I think I took ICND1, and then work and life kept me busy and employed and doing other things, and I never circled around and took ICND2. So I never even got my CCNA. I've done as difficult things as the CCIE before, and I have a lot of respect for everyone who's went and got one. And there's a rigor to that, and I feel I always wanted to go after CCIE data center, but there were things in that learning track that I was like, well, that's useless. I am not gonna. I looked at everything in the blueprint. I'm like, I am not learning this 40% of garbage. Like, no. So I'm hoping. I haven't seen the blueprint for enterprise, but I'm kind of hoping that the entire set of it is something that I can be fairly relevant and it's going to stick around for a while. Now, if I end up putting many hundreds of hours into ACI 4.0 or something like that, I'm sure I might be back here in a year crying, but we'll see. But I'm not really sure, but I see value in it, and the folks who design those learning programs, they put a lot of work into it. So I think it'll be good for me because I need some rounding out in a few areas. And as I've drifted in and out of networking, I feel like I've skipped a few things. So you poke at me, you'll find that I'm actually very shallow in a few areas.
You interested in any of the DevNet certs that have come out, Tommy?
Yeah, I would like to go into them. I haven't looked into them at all, but I feel like there's probably some good competence in the techniques being taught and the kind of the principles. So I'd like to go after those too, I think.
So that's the question that I have. Does it teach enough of those basics and those fundamentals and those principles, or is when you get into an automation certification, is it getting so deep into a specific vendor's ecosystem and world and way of doing things that it's like, I can't really apply too much of this to the broader world? I mean, because that was what Cisco certifications have been historically, right? A lot of us that are network professionals came up through the ranks that way. We did the CCNA and the CCNP and maybe the CCIE, and along the way, yeah, some of it was Cisco specific, but by and large, it was about networking more broadly. Now, as we get into the automation world, man, so many of the automation solutions are targeted at a specific vendor's ecosystem and way of doing things and what their APIs offer, what their tooling is that they, kind of want you to do. So if you go down that road, are you kind of like, I'd be locking in a Cisco DevNet perspective? Would I be locking into Cisco's view on automation? And it's kind of a different thing from back in the day. You take a Cisco cert and learn a lot of networking fundamentals that happen to be really good for your Cisco stuff. I don't know. I mean, I feel like,
well, certifications are becoming more specialized, aren't they? I think we're becoming more specialized. Is that a good thing? I don't think so, but
well, I mean, there's not a lot of room for everybody to be super specialized anymore, because the other trend is we're all supposed to be generalists. We're all supposed to walk in and know something about 3 different clouds at least, and several different disciplines. And maybe we got a few things we're deeply knowledgeable about. But, if you spend all this time investing in specialized certs, is that a good or a bad thing? I mean, it's not. You used to be, you went down the Cisco cert ladder because, man, you could build your career on that. I mean, Tommy, you pointed out you did ICND1, and that was good enough to just get you off and running, and off you went. You didn't even have to go and get the rest. You springboarded off of one exam.
I think it's also speed as well, Ethan. I mean, look at when there was this whole period from 2001 right through the 2000s to 2010 when nothing changed. It was all the same protocols, the same hardware, the same, same cables, same power. I even got to the point where I could memorize all the different power cables and things. But the pace of change that's picked up from 2010 and going into 2020, we're already talking about SD-WAN, and in a good SD-WAN environment, you may not need to know OSPF to the depth that you needed to 10 years ago. Take, for example, people who work on Meraki, they don't really need to know a whole lot about OSPF because Meraki doesn't implement any of the features, any of the funky features. So if they're not even in the products anymore, do you really need to know what an OSPF area is? And how much longer do we need to support those technologies?
Do we really want to do that?
Well, Russ, this goes back to what you were just saying, specialist versus generalist, and is it wise to become overly specialized?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know many race car drivers who don't know how the race car works. I think we tend to think that because we have a pretty CLI or a pretty way of doing automation that we don't need to know how it works anymore, how to design it anymore. I just don't agree with that. I think in the long run, that's going to bite us in the butt.
Well, there's a difference between being a push button operator that can check boxes and, you know, magic's supposed to
George
happen. And if the
Jetson.
magic doesn't happen, yeah, then you call TAC and say, hey, I'm trying to fly my spaceship and anyway, something's not working. Can you help me out?
I
One of
think
the interesting things about cloud platforms is that when you contact the vendor for tech support, everything's in their cloud, and they can actually see more about your network than you do, and so they can actually fix you. There's a transition here. In the old days, vendors had to rely on what you told them, so the customer had to be smart and intelligent and know what was going on. But increasingly, with SD-WAN controllers and ACI controllers that report home to the head office, into some sort of cloud platform, they know they can reach out and configure the system, provided you give them permission, in theory, and tell you what's going wrong a lot of the time.
You know, those of you that are out there in reseller land dealing with customers and so on, does Cisco still have the stranglehold on the market such that if you get a Cisco certification, that's your ticket? My opinion is not as much anymore and trending less, but there's still lots of folks that are aligned with Cisco. So particularly if you work for a reseller, you can do awfully good. But if you're just a person working for an enterprise, does having a Cisco cert, is it all that meaningful like it used to be? You know, the salary numbers would suggest that once upon a time, the CCIE was like the thing. You went and got that and you made the most money you could write your ticket. It's not so true anymore. That's all kind of moved over to cloud and stuff. So, you know, what's my motivation to go down the new Cisco track, I guess?
To be honest, I haven't really put that much rigor into the thought on it. I feel like, it's more like a rite of passage thing for me at this point. I want to do it because there's definitely a discipline to learning it and labbing it and going through. And I know that going through that process is going to make a few things that I don't have in my tool belt stick. From the development standpoint, I've done a few Python courses and I've learned a lot. And then when I've gone from that and gone back to do PowerShell, like what used to take me 1,000 lines takes 250 now. So like things starting to stick, and I'm hopefully when I get to looking at the blueprints, those things are definitely there. One point I will make though, right? You were talking about, is it a ticket? And you mentioned like the salary things. What I will say is the demand is still there. So there are a ton of organizations coming up on massive refreshes of equipment in the field. Lots of folks who've held on to things 5 to 7 years. And regardless of whether or not they just go to Cisco and pick the next 2950 or 3750 version switch or whatever they put into their campus stacks or wherever, there is a competence required to implement, and sometimes we struggle to find folks who aren't going to cause a full site outage trying to upgrade a closet at campus. And so there's plenty of work.
And you're talking about just networking knowledge.
Yeah,
routing,
like
switching, fundamentals.
Just making sure that you understand that yes, we're still running spanning tree, and you can't just do that way. Making sure, because otherwise, if you push the work down to true just level ones, right, then you're in for a world of hurt. So like when my group scopes implementations, we still put a very senior architect at the helm, and almost like someone at the CCNP level, just above the guys turning the wrenches and ripping the cables out. Because if we don't, it's just pain. It's so much pain. And if you go into the data center with that same kind of mindset, the pain just amplifies. So I still think there's plenty of work to be done. The longevity of employment, I don't know, like that's slowly there's still a level of competency required. So I think the low-hanging fruits are going to start to dwindle, but folks will. And
you underscored Russ's point nicely. The fundamentals are still required. Networking is still networking, and connectivity is still connectivity. We've layered all this crap on top. We've added automation, which is not a solution; it's tooling that helps us with the solution, which is building a network. And those are different things. Automation is something that is helps us get to the end game, but it is, if you can't be an automation expert and not understand what it is you're automating. So, and I know, Russ, I'm echoing things that you've written about at some length.
5,868 times, or
Yeah.
I'm not saying that there's no need for skilled engineers, but increasingly I'm of the view that the old days of the I-shaped engineer who was a deep specialist in a specific thing, there were engineers who were service provider specialists or enterprise data center or enterprise campus, right? Whereas we're moving much more to a T-shaped where you might be particularly skilled in the data center, but that's not as deep because you're also now doing campus and wireless and some data center and some WAN, and you're probably doing something in the cloud as well. And you're not going to be able to find time to do the deep discipline stuff. And what will happen is over time, as you get more and wider, you're not going to have the motivation to get deep on anything, because by the time you get deep on the arcane things around a per VLAN spanning tree using rapid spanning tree to spanning tree integration, you're already up in the AWS cloud trying to work out how to do a VPC and configure whatever it is that's going on. I think there's a transition here where the days of being specialized in a single vendor's equipment is passing away, and you're more likely to work in a multi-platform environment. So you might work on ACI in the data center, but you might have a different SD-WAN strategy, but you might have a different campus strategy, and you're going to spend most of your life in the SDN. You're not going to spend your life at a CLI speaking some arcane language. There's a transition. That's not to say that there'll be no certification. I think it'll be a different form of certification to what you see today. And the vendors have been very slow to change.
Well, I think, but the problem that you're pointing out there, though, Greg, is that I don't think that alleviates the need for the fundamentals. Like from my perspective, the way I've always seen it is I can move off Juniper to Cisco or Cisco to Juniper or Juniper to Arista because I know the right questions to ask because I understand how BGP works, right? I know what to interrogate to find what I need to do. Now, there may be some arcane feature I don't know, right? If somebody asks me, well, how do you configure this on that particular box? I'm always like, dude, it's called a search engine, right? I don't really care. That's not the point. The point is, can you describe to me how OSPF converges on this topology? And what happens if you do these area boundaries or if you do aggregation versus summarization? If I understand those things, I don't really need to care so much about the CLI anyway. So I think what I'm afraid of, though, is I'm afraid we're going the opposite direction, which is it's literally just a push button. I don't even know how OSPF works.
Yeah, no, that's not. I agree with you. My point is though that when I was studying for the CCIE, part of it was keyboard speed, how fast you could type those commands.
Yeah, definitely.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That is no longer a skill. What you really want to be able to do is, can you tell me why OSPF to EIGRP redistribution is a bad idea, or how MPLS EVPN work, whatever it is that's the latest thing that they would put into a certification, and that's a massive transition between then and now.
Yep, exactly, and I agree. Certifications haven't followed there. I'm playing with stuff in this area, but I don't want to say much more. I've been talking about it for a while.
So Meg, I don't know that we answered the question very well for you, but because it's not the slam dunk it once was to just go do whatever Cisco certs there are and your career will follow. It's a more complicated question in today's environment. So
well, you can ask me again in a year.
Yeah.
You're gonna be the enterprise, huh?
And if I have more bags under my eyes, or I'm drinking beer instead of coffee at 10 o'clock in the morning, we'll see what's up.
So Tom Bragg has joined us. Tom has dropped into the call. Tom, hi, real quick. Who are you and what do you do?
Hey, nice to be here. So I've been working mostly with architecture, and I just caught a little bit of what Greg was saying about different shaped people, where they were either I-shaped or T-shaped. I'm kind of underscore shaped, where I'm spread thinly across all of the technology across the top, learning basically whatever it is I need to know.
Perfect. Well, you've joined our Hollywood Squares here. We're working up for a 3x3 grid in the live stream. That is wonderful. Next question then comes in from John. John asks, Cisco's come out with SDA, and there have been, or has there been, discussions that SDA and ACI are going to merge into a single fabric in the future. And you guys got some inside dope on that and might know. Last I knew that, I hadn't heard that was a thing, and I thought the technologies were somewhat very different, but I haven't been too overly connected to that. Anybody heard about SDA and ACI maybe merging as a fabric?
Well, isn't ACI VXLAN backed and
SDA is Lisp.
SDA
SDA
is
is Lisp.
Lisp-backed.
As far as I
so
know,
you have
yeah.
to marry those two technologies together, or
Yeah.
revamp one or the other, or federate them somehow in some competent manner.
I think in the end, this is something that I wrote in a white paper that's published on Ignition. If you remember there, ultimately you can't have a different SDN controller for different parts of the network because they're not actually separate networks. This is one of Russ White's favorite things. It's all a network. They're not different networks. They're not special networks. They're all just networks. Now, while I disagree in broad terms, I agree with him in specific terms. There's no, at the end of the day, the campus still forwards Ethernet frames and routes IP packets. Whether you're encapsulating a Lisp or encapsulating EVPN is trivial overall. I mean, if you look at NSX, sometimes it's encapsulating Geneva, sometimes it's encapsulating in VXLAN, and sometimes it's using other encapsulations. You don't know, and you don't care so long as the control plane disappears them. Does ACI and SDA merge? I actually think Viptela and SDA merges because I think the campus is a branch and the branch is a WAN, and I think they will merge. I don't see ACI moving to take over the campus because those are different. What happens in the data center is it's configuring servers and VLANs, and ACI is about data at rest, and ACI should control public clouds and your private data centers and that sort of stuff. And then what will happen is that the SD-WAN will take control via its branch networking functions to absorb the wireless at the branch, and then eventually come into your campus and take over your Ethernet wired and your Ethernet wireless networks and orchestrate them as part of a data in motion network, if that makes sense.
Well, it's user centric versus application centric. I mean, they feel like two different things. Marrying those policy engines together just sounds like a horrifying nightmare to me. Tommy, I don't know if you were the one that made the suggestion, but the idea of trying to connect those two through some sort of federation seems like the only way you could tackle it, on the assumption that the underlying technologies of Lisp and VXLAN for the segmentation and so on are going to stay the same. You'd have to have policy abstractions to push those and marry those in. But then why would you? Because it feels like they're solving two different problems.
Well, I think what they're going to do, I've seen this, a good example of this is the integration between the Palo Alto solutions and the VMware solutions. They actually don't go near as far as you think. Like, they say they're integrated, but then when you push on it a little, you find that, like in that example, they're really just moving not access lists, but groups between. They're doing IP address and forms so that you can build policy on both sides, and you want it to be like nice and elegant and be able to write a policy in one and have it show up in the other. None of that actually happens. The integration is barely skin deep. It's just an exchange of information. So they might start with that, right? Just being able to keep those kinds of things, access lists and groups and things like that, consistent between those platforms. It's a pretty big, it eases some burden on the operators, right? I see Ned shaking his head because when you have to go to the 25 different APIs and make sure you create the same group the same way with the same members, someone's going to screw it up. And so those kinds of things make it hard. So I think there's going to be some nice, elegant pieces to it, but I don't think it's going to be so drastic as actually like making it all one happy fabric. I don't see that happening.
Unhappy fabric.
Unhappy fabric. Yes. Sad panda, right? Because you have controllers all over the place coming out of sync with each other, and then you
the flip
just
side,
imagine troubleshooting it. Just spend
now
like
the flip
90
side
seconds
of this,
thinking about that.
And now the flip side of this question, and I've talked to people in different companies about this, why would you have a data center and a campus and an SD-WAN? And the answer is that's what customers buy. So when the sales rep goes out on site, he talks to a campus person who's doing wireless and LAN. Then he talks to another person who's doing branch and WAN. And he's talking to another person who's doing data center and another person who's doing public cloud. And so the vendors sell products that customers will buy. And as long as you're telling a vendor in the sales bit, oh, I'm upgrading my data center network today, that product will be different to the product that you buy for the SD-WAN. It won't be integrated. Unless you go to them and say, I need these to look like one. Like, there's no reason for there to be one SD-WAN controller for the WAN and another SD-WAN controller for the campus, except it makes it easier to convince you to buy it. And that is a factor, a serious factor in why products are packaged up the way they are. They have to be packaged in a way that the customer will buy them. And that's a consideration here.
So we have to be smarter purchasers. Is that what you're saying, Jeff? It's all our fault.
Is that victim blaming? I think that might be victim blaming.
Victim shaming would be a
Victim
better
shaming,
word. But victim shaming in this case. But I do think we have to be better customers. Yeah, I think you're right, Russ. We do need to be better customers. We can't let vendors convince us that if only we were dumber and just did what they told us, we'd have better networks, because clearly that hasn't worked, right? You need to be competent. You need to be caveat emptor. You need to have enough competency in your team to make smart buying decisions. And a dumb buying decision is one that says, oh, I've got a SD-WAN over here and my branch networks are managed separately from my WAN. They should be part of the WAN, in my view. And indeed, there are entire companies doing exactly that.
I think the other thing is you see folks like Arista who are making the argument that why have two separate networks? Why have a data center and a campus that are separated when they could essentially be the same? And Arista would say, manage it all under our cloud vision using our architecture and our switches. And I think they can make a strong case for that. It's just that Cisco's got a bunch of different product lines that they're selling to different folks, like Greg says. So that's one of the reasons we get this kind of split.
Okay, next question here comes from Kyle. Now, Kyle, I just looked you up on LinkedIn. So, man, I see who you're working for. You should probably be answering this question and not us, but if you are who I think you are. But okay, we'll take the bait and ask you, talk about your question here. How do you guys feel about the current state of virtualized network performance, that is VNFs? Do you think the current tech is good enough in the near term, or do we need GPU acceleration, other hardware-based acceleration tech in order to enable the promises of 5G and beyond? Now, Kyle works for a large service provider that would, of course, be living in this world and needing to deploy some VNFs and this kind of stuff, presumably out at the edge, and all those kind of things that 5G is good for. So, Russ,
remember that if you haven't found the trade-offs, you haven't looked hard enough.
Well, I also think the answer is
abstraction's great, but every thunk layer you add on, yes, you need lots of acceleration. You need to cut back through those layers to make it work fast.
Well, yes and no, but depending on how you've scaled it out, right? Because one argument you can make is architecturally, we're just going to spread this over lots of x86 hardware and the Linux kernel, and
but you're still eating power and processing speed, and you're still eating, heat dissipation and everything else. And so, you can play that game. You can say, I'm going to take a 10 core processor and dedicate 4 cores to switching packets rather than using an ASIC. Yeah. Okay. Great for you, but not so great for your power bill.
And Kyle, in fairness, you did frame this as VNFs, because I was thinking, like Ned, you and I talked to some folks, Mobile Edge X, I believe, at KubeCon, and one of their things was, we're going to drop a hardware stack in out at the network edge and then sell that compute power to whoever needs it. And what the use case was would depend on what that application was. They cited gaming developers, for example, that are trying to make sure an augmented reality game functions quickly enough, and doing it in the public cloud is too much latency. So that was their play. And some of that was GPU accelerated, if I remember right, Ned.
It was, yeah.
Yeah. But that's not a VNF question. That's a specific application, out there. So, Russ, going back to you, if we want to talk about VNF specifically, you give us some hardware acceleration requirements that are VNF specific.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm thinking there's so many hardware accelerators out there. Which one's going to win? XDP, VNF. I mean, what is going on, and how are we going to make use of this stuff in a way that makes sense? That's a harder problem to me. Which doesn't answer the question, but that's kind of where my mind goes.
I think so. My sense of it is that the idea that the CPU can keep taking us forward for performance is done. We know that Intel's reached pretty much the limits of its CPU architectures, not going to get faster.
Yep.
So what we've seen is a progression from graphics processor units, GPUs, to TPUs, to chiplets. So we're seeing Intel's been out there and bought ASIC companies so that it can make tiny custom purpose chips. We're going to see better front side buses, so the faster PCI buses, so they can move data around outside of the CPU. And part of that is you're going to see NICs, fancy NICs with accelerators. So things like Mellanox, Apposite, Netronome. And that's where particularly AWS has a big edge with its custom ASICs. And what you're also going to see is those ASICs are also going to form a root of trust. So you're going to have these enclaves on those pieces of silicon where you put them in a PC, and they're actually going to be, especially in servers where VNFs are, they'll be a root of trust. And when the system boots, the NIC boosts first with a trusted operating system, validates the base, the BMC and the whole motherboard, and then the server boots before even the operating system loads, before VMware loads, validates that the system is safe and trusted. And that's how public clouds are doing bare metal, is because they actually, the point of control is in the NIC, not in the server, because servers aren't safe and secure. They're never designed to be safe and secure. So I think this whole co-processor model is going to go on. We're going to see GPUs, TPUs, network processor units. We're already seeing storage companies lean heavily into smart NICs using networking processor units to do storage calculations. So they're doing a lot of the CRC checks and the table lookups in the ASICs themselves. And
which means the network becomes more important, by the way.
yes, and it also means we can drive 400 gig interfaces out of a server, because
Right.
they're offloading that processing into the
Yep.
NIC, not being done in the CPU like it is today. So my belief is that VNFs, if you're running appliances on a server at a remote edge, they're going to lean heavily into these hardware acceleration engines of all sorts. Some of the VNFs that you might put out there, like for radio, might want to use a custom array of DSPs to do the signal processing. Others might want to use a network interface card, like a firewall or an IDS or some sort of networking service would lean heavily into the network processor unit to get improved performance. And others will use, TPUs to do artificial intelligence on the data logging. I think that's going to be the way of the future. And it's going to disrupt a lot of server makers, because you can't just produce one model for fits all. You're going to have this highly customized servers, and it's going to change the way the market works.
Okay, let's move on to the next topic, folks. I think Kyle, I think we got you something there, and as you admit in the comments, it was indeed a loaded question coming for you. But I think we got some good thoughts on that.
Apparently, there's some competition about best Christmas outfits, so I want to let everybody know I've got my Kitty Cat.
Oh my!
I couldn't see
Christmas
that.
sweater
I gave
on. I
Drew
know.
props without thinking
I cropped
about
things
it.
in a little bit, but I wanted to make sure everyone understood that I am wearing a Christmas
I'm
sweater.
so underdressed.
One might say you're overdressed. You're the one wearing a button down.
Yeah, I'm wearing pajamas, so I am the one dressed.
All right, let's talk from Chad and Kai and Brian. You plus one Chad's request here. So you guys want to hear us talk about zero trust environment, software defined perimeter. Have any of us worked on this stuff? Do we have any thoughts here? And you'd also love a heavy networking episode on software defined perimeter, Chad. And yeah, you're not the first one that's asked that. We, as an emerging term, we've there's a bunch of vendors glomming onto that, but we haven't dove in exactly. Okay, so first of all, anyone in this crowd, have you worked on it, have an opinion about it, something you'd like to share on software-defined perimeter zero trust?
I'll get us started mostly on a vocabulary question. Does the group as a whole find that everyone has a different definition of it? Like, to me, getting so close to the DevOps space for a while, for a few years there, I expect that to mean that the application does not trust anything outside of it. And when it makes calls, no matter what transport it's going across, it maintains its own security defense. And then I see other folks saying, oh, the network's going to do it. And I'm like, what? Like, I completely lose it, because now we have all these middle boxes cropping up doing inspection and doing these kinds of things, and I just don't see the value in it. So I'm curious what other perspectives folks are saying. What is zero trust? It's a loaded question, but it's like the same thing. Like, I think of Inigo Montoya saying, I don't think that means what you think it means.
I think it all depends, like you said, on your perspective and context. What portion of the stack are you most concerned with? And that's where you're going to apply your zero trust lens to. So I was on I helped write an RFP response for a company that wanted to do zero trust networking, all the way down to all the endpoints, like their desktops and tablets, into the server. So literally everything that hit the switch needed to go backhauled in their world. They wanted all backhauling to a firewall for inspection. And that was their concept of zero trust. And so there's a certain amount of education we had to do with them that's not exactly what it means to be zero trust. You can do things with certificates, so not everything has to be inspected, because they were looking at these firewalls that were, oh God, they were like $1 million a piece to backhaul all of this traffic through them. So that was pretty brutal.
And it traps you into this brutal architecture. So,
Oh, yeah.
Ooh, I just see the monstrosity of having to basically break encryption everywhere.
Mhm.
It's literally, if the network's going to do it, it's literally what you have to do. And then the need to rotate keys and re-encrypt everything and keep control of that. I just think about it, like most folks can barely do it on like a single F5. And I'm like, hold on, you're going to do this across the entire campus, the WAN, the data center, everywhere? Okay, like show me.
There's a reason.
I'm skeptic on that one.
There's a reason that project never got off the ground. Like I think they
Mhm.
got 5 RFP responses from when I talked to someone who left the company afterwards, and none of the responses measured up to what they want. They're all way more expensive than they had planned out to be, and they just ended up scrapping the whole project because they had unrealistic expectations of what was possible on their budget. But also probably unrealistic expectations about what they actually needed from a security standpoint. And I kind of lean more towards what you were saying, Tommy, with having the application not trust the underlying infrastructure and have it handle its own security to a certain degree, store its keys, and encrypt everything at rest and in transit within the application, as opposed to relying on the constructs provided by the networking or the storage subsystem or the compute. And I've seen things moving in that direction depending on who's doing the development.
Yeah, Chad just added to the chat here that he's seeing the concept of zero trust network being sold as a VPN replacement, which is kind of more the way I've heard different folks talk about it. It's in the context of user admission, and bringing them on the network, and how do you get them on the network in a particular way? And it's zero trust. We don't trust anybody, but we're going to bring you on, and then through. It's kind of like glorified NAC is yet another way I've heard the market describe this, or some market people go after this.
Yet another project type that always seems to be underfunded, overcomplicated, and never gets completed.
So what's interesting is you talk about middle boxes. Is I saw some research pretty recently. I wrote about it on my blog. I think that something like 20% of all TLS sessions are man in the middle, or some crazy number.
Oh wow!
So it's a much larger number than I expected. When I first looked at it, I was like, "What? Really? That's crazy." But it is. It seems like
the thing that most people don't take into account there, I only discovered this recently, is virus scanners. A lot of virus scanners on Windows intercept or man in the middle the SSL session, so they can scan the stuff so then everything is a lot of traffic then looks like it's actually being man in the middle when it's actually not. You could ask yourself whether those virus scanners are actually good decisions, because often they're free.
They're
and
not.
as we discovered recently, companies like Avast are actually collecting data and then selling it. So they sell all of your web page history, all of that, off to somebody else. In fact, it's actually a very good corporate intelligence leak, a data leak. Companies out there can buy the data from your Avast and then actually measure up to see if you're a viable enterprise IT customer or not, as the case may be. So I think the man in the middle thing is misleading, because a lot of virus scanners do the interception. It's not actually a real number at large, and a lot of it's corporate. So, and I think the thing about zero trust at the end of the day is it has to be in the app, not in the operating system.
Right. Exactly.
So most of the zero trust.
You see the rise of DOH and that being used in all the browsers to keep even DNS queries encrypted away from the operating system. So that would be an example of how that's happening. But I think I totally stepped on Tom's toes on that one. Sorry.
That's all right. No worries. Now, I was going to say, I think this is the general move away from using the network as the point of trust, where we used to have the fortified network that sat in the office that was completely trusted, and anybody on it was completely trusted, to a world where people are working from anywhere, from their phone, tablet, Wi-Fi, 3G, hotel Wi-Fi, whatever it is, and you can't rely on the underlying network to do the work for you. And VPN has been such a hassle for users generally that we're moving further and further away from it. So going down to the software-defined perimeter is pushing that trust back into the apps as we go more and more into using SaaS services and things like that. That's where it's moving. It's the authentication point is going away from the machine and the network into the user and the application instead. And that's only going to continue that trend as we go forwards.
I think it's important to remember that VPNs were about adding encryption to unencrypted traffic. They That was their primary purpose, with some authentication. They weren't actually meant to change the security posture of the organization. You had all this unencrypted HTTP and Word documents and printer traffic. And the point of a VPN was today we have HTTPS everywhere. So most remote access VPNs can just be replaced with TLS and we're done. You know, if you HTTPS enable your web app and put an authentication window on it, you've just replaced your IPsec VPN from start to finish logically. So if you can apply HTTPS authentication to every one of the applications that your organization uses, you've then got zero trust because everything gets logged in. Now that's the simple story. The harder story, of course, is that your environment is full of printers and they don't log in, right? And nobody logs into the printers, right? Or you've got door locks or some sort of environmental system that was built 30 years ago and nobody's going to replace it to use zero trust. So the gap is what, yeah.
I mean, there's solutions for that stuff. There's solutions. So Aruba, I've seen some presentations from them recently where they're tackling this, and they have answers for all of this. I'm being hesitant to say there are solutions for this because there are products that purport to tackle these problems. How well they work, because a lot of them are new and emerging and are maybe solution specific or have a significant hardware dependency or these kind of things. There's always these big asterisks about how effectively they're going to work for you or what investment you have to make to get this total package that are going to give you that answer. But it's not like that's unknown. That is a thing that is being tackled by vendors. How deep are you into their ecosystem? How deeply do you want to go?
Yeah, some of them do zero trust and identify the printers by their traffic and their MAC addresses, and they fingerprint it. And then they say that is a trusted device. And if it gets out of profile, like if it starts sending traffic that's not printer traffic, then it's not to be trusted. Is that zero trust? That's, it's edge networking of a sort. So, it might be sufficient zero trust to get you a step further down the path. It would be better if you just took all your printers and threw them in the bin.
Yes,
but
please do.
You say that as I have a networked printer sitting over my shoulder back here because I still got to print stuff from now on again. It's terrible.
Oh, it's unfortunate, isn't it? In the paperless age, we have to print so much.
It's actually cheaper for me to go up the road and buy a new printer than it is to buy a printer cartridge.
Yes. Yeah, I run into the same thing.
Yeah. Which makes me incredibly sad.
I wonder if there's a market out there for retrofitting copiers and printers with some sort of security like dongle on them to provide that. That probably already
physically man in the middle.
Yeah.
No, I've lost track of it, but yeah, there was a product like that, Ned, that
like a
that Avaya
condom.
Networks was selling. Yeah, it was basically that. It really was. It was based on shortest path bridging.
Photoshop that.
You plug your device into the little thing. The little thing was a shortest path bridging endpoint, and that's how you could protect this thing. They were targeting it more for medical, where there was some MRI machine that you couldn't mess with the OS or upgrade software or anything. And you'd stick that network condom, on the end of the cable, basically, to secure the thing.
When you think about what you actually do print to printers, like think about an executive assistant that's printing information about their boss, and that might be highly personal and interesting information that's riding the network, and it's probably not encrypted. I don't know if any of the printer protocols encrypt anything going across the wire.
Well, and the interesting part too is that the printers often have very large hard drives, multi-terabyte hard drives in them, and the jobs actually spool onto the hard drive before they print, and quite often they're not cleaned up. So if you throw a printer away, you quite often have to open it up and fish out the hard drive. And I actually have read articles over the years of people who buy printers off eBay or from disposal sites and get the hard drives out and look at the documents that have been printed. It's been, and they're like ex-military, that's what.
Oh, that's lovely. Good to know.
Now, the question that we originally fielded here was about software-defined perimeter / zero trust, which I don't think of as the same thing. I mean, they're kind of related, but software-defined perimeter is basically, to me, it's a new way to say, I need remote access to something, from no matter where I am. So maybe they're related, but I think of software-defined perimeter as it's kind of like glorified VPN, or maybe it's a different way to tackle the virtual private network problem, that we used to have.
Glorified VPN.
Well, because that's how some of these companies that have pitched to me, we're a software-defined perimeter company, and you look at what it is, it's like, oh, so you're an IPsec termination service, except you're in the cloud.
It's just the desktop.
I've used Palo Alto's Global Protect pretty successfully, and I've seen some advanced configurations of that. I've been pretty impressive because you have your gateways that you attach to when the posture of your machine tells you you're supposed to do that, and it's having like laptops out in the field or any device really be always on, and certain things split tunnel or go different ways. It's been kind of interesting, and I've always kind of wondered, maybe I shouldn't say it out, maybe it's an idea I should take to a venture capital firm, but why isn't there like a local box you can put on site that can be aware of clients that can bring that SD-WAN multi-transport concept to that? Like, hey, I have a client on site and it needs to get to these 2 data centers because that's their application or into the cloud. And if it had like a waypoint, using a term I'm working on right now, if it had a waypoint to hop through that was intelligent enough to use multiple paths to protect that conversation, that'd be pretty darn slick. Because if you get to a good posture with Global Protect, you can do some cool stuff. Like, and it just works. I'm pretty sure it still comes up against the, oh, I forgot my password problems and I can't get to anything and I'm orphaned and things like that.
I saw an architecture that was like what you're describing, Tommy. Before Oracle bought Talari, they partnered with somebody, the name of the company I've forgotten, but you basically did a VPN termination to them, and then you would interconnect that cloud-based VPN termination service with your home base over the Talari box to optimize connectivity. So you could jump from there and then go up off into the cloud and be automated and secured. You'd have connectivity back into home base for authentication and logging purposes. And you could share out over your Talari connection optimized applications that way as well. Now Oracle's bought Talari. Who knows what's happened with all of that? It's probably all blown up to smithereens. But I mean, yeah, that architecture was a thing that was I think it was roughly a loose integration is how you describe it. But there was a partnership to try to give you the capabilities that sounded more or less like what you just described. So someone's thinking
some
about
of
it.
some of the SD-WAN companies are headed in that direction. They're folding the security into the appliance.
Yeah.
And that already moves a lot of the security right out to the edge of the branch. And once it's in a branch device, it could also be placed in a switch. Cisco's been trying to do this with security SGT, security group tags, and SGA for over a decade and not really had a lot of success. They haven't been able to get the endpoint piece to recognize an endpoint to add a tag. They've had the piece. But I think some of the SD-WAN vendors are getting closer. It'll be interesting to watch how those vendors, with the security focus, they're not focused so much on the WAN piece because that's just core competency now. Everybody's got an SD-WAN story that does, dynamic paths and analytics and cloud controllers. It's like, earwax. Everybody's got
SD-WAN to the desktop, man.
Yep. And that is the logical, and that is exactly the logical extension of SD-WAN is it should be in your smartphone or your laptop or your 5G connected laptop. And I think that's where it'll evolve to over time. And at that point, the campus becomes irrelevant, right? Because if every one of your laptops has an SD-WAN edge client on board, then what's the value of a campus network?
It's all
except as it's cheaper than a 5G network.
Do you think there are categories like this where we have solved and competent solutions out in the field today that work just fine, that don't really warrant or need replacement, and someone's, a problem looking for or solution looking for a problem type stuff? Do you think that's like incurring upon some of the things we're doing? Because that's a perfect example I just gave. Like I've seen very competent Global Protect rollouts, and I'm like, that's pretty fantastic. Like that pretty much gets the job done on a number of layers. And I see other ideas come up and I'm like, implementation pain. Like why am I changing something that works well? Like, is there a chink in the armor I'm trying to solve for or not? And so I keep coming up against, that seems to just come in like cruise missiles from the side constantly right now.
And there's a whole different bunch of ways to do it as well, right? Because you've got Forescout that uses all of the devices in the network. You've got, and you've got other people who want to put an agent on the edge. You've got other people who want to do inline inspection. You've got other people. There's so many different ways to do it, but we haven't, as an industry, converged on one. And at the end of the day, it's like SD-WAN has been around for 20 years, like since the late 90s. But all of a sudden, SD-WAN got its day in the sun, and now we're converging around a form of SD-WAN, which is, automated failover, public WAN, blah, blah, blah. The question will come is, when does Zero Trust get its day, get its time? And I think it's getting closer because we're seeing a lot more There's a lot more pound. There's a lot more beat to that rhythm than there was 5 years ago.
Yeah, it's just so hard for me to call zero trust something that's net new, because we've had NAC forever, and we've had microsegmentation as a very significant data center movement, especially recently. And what is all of that when you boil it right down? It's zero trust. So
NAC 2.0 wasn't going to get any venture money, but zero trust was, so that's what we got.
that's right. Nailed it. Oh, exactly right. All right. Well, we're coming up on the hour. We don't have any more questions that I've seen, unless I missed something. If one of you guys want to punch something in real quick, go for it if you're on the YouTube chat. But I think that's it. Let's give our holiday wishes to the nice folks as we go around the table real quick. And wait, Tom Bragg, you're in the UK, right? You're UK based somewhere.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Are there traditional holiday greetings that you could share? Or is it just Merry Christmas? Is that it?
Just Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Very
Merry
good.
Christmas.
Okay.
Isn't it supposed to be Happy Christmas in the UK though?
Yeah, that's what I heard.
Very happy, whatever.
Come on, I want the original.
Whatever Christmas.
The UK version uses Merry because that tends to imply that you might have had a drink or two beforehand. So it's a Merry Christmas.
What about you, Greg? You're from Australia. Are there any non-Merry Christmas sort of traditional greetings? You're muted.
Australia, of course, is in the southern hemisphere, so it's summer over there. And in fact, right now it's having its hottest summer on record, perhaps ever. So apparently down there it's quite a different lifestyle. There's lots of different things down there, just simply because it's Christmas Day. When I was a family, we would go to the beach and surf, which for most people in the northern hemisphere would be like just a completely different things about wrong. So no, they don't have a different way of doing it, except maybe have a stubby, which is a type of have a bottle of beer. But for me, I actually am living in the UK, so Merry Christmas to everybody, and make sure you come back in the new year. Thanks so much for putting up us in 2019. We'll still be here in 2020. So
we will be.
Yeah, sucks to be you.
Special greeting from you, Russ White.
Oh, just Merry Christmas. Come find me on my blog and on my podcast, and whatever. I'm around.
He says in his understated way, rule11.tech. And of course, he's got the Hedge networking podcast, which I've been enjoying. My favorite from the year from the Hedge, Russ, was the two-parter you did with Jeff Huston, tearing apart DOH. That was a great discussion.
Goodness. Yeah. Wow.
That was a good one. What about you, Ned Bellavance, with your crazy shirt?
Just Merry Christmas and Happy
Stand
holidays. Stand up again.
While you
All
say,
right.
yeah. Now you can say it.
Yeah, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, eat a lot of cookies. That's easily my favorite thing about the whole holiday is all the food. So I'm excited for cookies and other things that my wife and I will make and give to all of our wonderful family.
Yeah, I saw on your Twitter feed that you had made bread. You enjoyed the cracking sound it made, and then you cut it to show the crumb. I'm like, yes. You Julia Child?
Oh my God. If you go on Breadit, which is the bread subreddit, if you post a picture of your bread, you also have to post the crumb. No lie.
I didn't even know that was a thing. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's a bit of a problem. But there are worse habits.
Tommy McNicholas, any special greetings for the folks?
Well, I think the next time we do this, we'll have to go through the airing of grievances and the feats of strength. But other than that, I don't know. We're a pretty friendly crowd, so you get a Merry Christmas out of me.
All right, very good. Drew, with your pajama shirt.
Yeah, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. As I'm looking out my window right now on the East Coast, it is snowing, so very apropos.
All right.
You're right.
Well, not up here. I dealt with that yesterday as I was stuck in airports much more than I was stuck on the airplanes themselves due to some terrible weather. So Merry Christmas from me and from all of us at Packet Pushers. Thank you guys for joining. Thanks to those of you that watched. And as Greg said, tough luck for you. We're coming back in 2020. As soon as I figure out the magic button, we're going to sign out. Bye-bye,
Thanks,
everybody.
Bye-bye.